when he put pen to paper with Demonology, it became one of the best-selling books of the late 16th and early 17th century. It was James goes from being a skeptic into being like I would say hysterical. I mean, from skeptic to cheerleader is a frightening conversion.
Gareth, here we are at Harvington Hall for the Harvington History Festival. You're going to be talking about Queen James shortly. Now, you were very kind and gave me the first interview about your latest book, Queen James, back in, was it February?
I think it was February. Yeah, it would have been February.
Yeah. So how's the book being received?
Well, first of all, it wasn't kind. It was a real honour for me because, I mean, you were there when I was finishing Queen James, and slightly mad. And the slight madness has continued. So James has landed brilliantly. I've been so touched by it, by how people have responded to it. So it has just been travelling a lot since it came out. And then also, because there's a gap between the UK publication and the American publication in winter, you're sort of getting the American proofs through. So it's the identical book, but it was like, you're picking out where to put illustrations differently. So it's sort of like, on one hand, you've got to completely finish here, but you're also getting to move things around a little bit for the North American edition.
Yeah. When's that coming out?
That is December the 2nd for Canada and the US.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, and I know many people are absolutely champing at the bit to get their hands on it.
Yes, that's very kind.
Which is great. Now, okay, so obviously the book looks at James's life. So we get a really good overview of the man he is. Obviously, the big part of it is the focus on his love life.
Yes.
Which I'm sure you've done many an interview about. So I don't want to repeat what you've sort of probably done millions of times before, but before we move on to the bit I want to talk to you about, which is, I'm quite fascinated about his attitude toward witches, which he's famous for having because of writing Demonology, but actually you show that anyway, we'll go into that. But before we do that, can you explain the title Queen James?
Yes.
Because when we did our interview, it was quite funny in the comments. It was almost like both
polar
sides,
opposite,
opposite attitudes to that. But explain where that comes from.
Yeah, great question. So Queen James is a contemporary nickname for James. It is recorded in a few letters by different people, but they all seem to congregate around 1623 and 1624. So the later years of his life. He dies in 1625. And it is, on the surface, it's mocking him by comparing him to his predecessor, Queen Elizabeth. So it's in Latin, but it was Elizabeth. We had King Elizabeth, now we have Queen James. And part of it was to mock his private life, and the other part was to mock his foreign policy. So quite interestingly, there were two versions of the joke, which is sort of getting into the weeds a bit. But there was one that just very clearly seems to be praising Elizabeth and denigrating James. There is the second version sort of says, we had King Elizabeth, now we have Queen James, a failure of nature in both. So they were rinsing them both and saying that the Elizabeth had been too much like a man in how she behaved, and James was too much like a woman.
There's just no pleasing
there's
people.
There's just no pleasing people. I think we were talking, you and I, recently about the way the public reacted to George IV's coronation by saying it's too expensive. And then his brother cut his coronation cost in half. They call it the half coronation. And then everyone was even more annoyed about that. So sometimes you just, in public opinion, you can't win. So that, I think, is what's happening with James and Elizabeth. But I was really interested in the idea of a nickname that at the time seemed to be mocking him and denigrating him. But for us, some of the things that people at the time criticized him for, his love life and also refusing to get the country involved in the 30 Years' War, are actually things that make him look a lot more courageous and intelligent. And one quote that I found that really moved me, actually, was when he sort of heard about the nickname of Queen James and about people pushing back about him not getting Britain involved in this massive war on the continent. He said that millions of mothers and children unborn will thank me for this. And I thought, well, that's so prescient and accurate. So the nickname is really, it creates a nice link between the fact that we use Queen for multiple meanings, it was used at the time, and that link between the present and the past, which is what you want as a reader with historical topic. And then when we took it over to America, really early on, they said, we would love it to be really clear about that who it's about. And also, James the First isn't just famous in North America as he would be here. And they when they got the final, so I knew they were probably going to have us think about the title. And then when they read it, they were so lovely about wanting to make it one of their Christmas releases. And one of the team said, I just think it's as interesting as Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Can we have a think about that? So I said, well, what about the 6 loves of James the First? So that's how you get the 2 different titles in Britain versus North America.
Well explained.
Thank you.
People have all sorts of theories as to why there was different titles.
Yeah, no, it was from the get-go. Actually, I think recently I was filing the the early paperwork when we signed with the 2 publishers, and the note was there, the title to be decided upon later, because I think they wanted it really. I think they wanted to see what the book was like, but yeah, it was always sort of to make sure that people knew what it's about. And to be honest, I'm quite lucky. Sometimes you can love one title and hate the other. I like them both equally.
Yeah, you get 2.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm very lucky. Yeah.
As I said, I want to ask you about James's attitude to witches and witchcraft, because he's famous for writing Demonology, which then shorthand makes people just say, oh, he was out to get witches, he was, and they were persecuted under him, but he didn't begin like that, did he? And it would explain.
No, I mean, where
that came about.
I mean, from the 6 loves to the one great hate of his life. Yeah, I mean, he was born into a period when the number of witch hunts were spiking substantially throughout Scotland in particular, and Northern Europe in general. But he is someone who believes it exists and is very much a product of that time in Scotland. And every country, every area has slightly different attitudes towards witchcraft. So one of the things that's quite interesting about Scottish witchcraft is the number of men that it goes after, as well as women. And they're charged with different things. So with women, it will be witchcraft. And with male suspects, it will be necromancy, which is specifically or typically magic that is allegedly performed with parts of corpses, like very, very dark magic. And when James is in his 20s, he marries Princess Anna of Denmark. And during the journeys to Scotland from Scandinavia, one of the worst storms in living memory batters Anna's ships. Then one hits James, then one hits both of them together. And the Danish crew say they've never seen anything like it, including the Danish admiral. And within Denmark, there's a really widespread belief that witches controlled the weather. And so the Danish government orders an investigation, the governor of Copenhagen gets involved, and they write to James to say, we think that there was a coven in Copenhagen, and the dark magic was pushed to a sister coven in Norway, and it was then linked to sort of partners in sin in Scotland. And bear in mind, they believe witches can travel fast and quickly, so that's how they think these messages are being carried. And they tell James that, we've tortured the suspects of the Copenhagen coven, and they've confessed. And James thinks, duh, of course they have. He's a smart cookie, and he thinks, well, if you tortured them, of course those poor people were going to say whatever you wanted them to say to stop. And there's a massive amount of pressure on James in Scotland, particularly from the Presbyterian leadership, to start this moral crusade and to keep pace with the hunt in Scandinavia. And he doesn't. He resists, and I always say in history, particularly in the history of the occult, and also I think of mass panics, there are things that you can't explain. In the same way people have some experiences that some will interpret as fluke, or clearly there's a rational explanation and others won't. James asks to see some of the suspects, and one of them, who I think, her name was Agnes Sampson, and the torture techniques to question her were every which way horrific. And even when they stopped, she kept insisting she was a witch. And I think probably the psychology of false confessions will play a massive role in that. But anyway, Agnes is probably one of the most tragic figures I've ever written about. It's just horrible how history happens to her. But she is brought in, and she continues to insist she is a witch. And she convinces James. And So he's a skeptic
up to this point.
He's a skeptic, and he has a kind of born again moment, and all of a sudden is completely convinced. He later becomes convinced that his cousin, on the illegitimate side of the royal family, the Earl of Bothwell, the nephew of the more famous one that people will know from Mary Queen of Scots, he becomes convinced that Bothwell is the head of this coven and is plotting to use necromancers and witches to steal the throne. And so James goes from being a skeptic into being like I would say hysterical. I mean, some of his letters are dancing on the line of sanity. It's like he sees them everywhere. And if you believe in these things, the idea that evil is walking in the dark and there's no electricity. I mean, the darkness at night is total. And the weather in the 1590s is off kilter. So he becomes fully and completely convinced. One of the men he'd formerly been in love with, a man called Alexander Lindsay, tries to stop him. His wife tries to stop him, and James falls out with both of them. And he spends the next couple of years after the witch hunt sort of exhausts itself working on demonology, defending it. But he then starts to get buyer's remorse, which is interesting. So he actually, before he's just finished demonology, but before it's printed, there's another witch hunt that erupts, and in 1596, and James this time starts to read the testimonies differently, and in particular, one of the accusers is revealed to be a fraud, and James starts bit by bit to slide back to that skepticism. So in that year, he takes a big political step and he closes down the standing committee that was set up to permanently investigate witchcraft, which obviously would have created so many more cases. If you're looking for it, you'll find it. And he does spend the rest of his life retreating from demonology until by 1616, when he's in England, you actually see him intervening in witch hunts in Leicestershire to shut them down and to ask the judges why they didn't look for proper proof, and he releases the prisoners. And then there was a quote I found from someone who'd served at his court who said by the end of his life, if he heard of a case of witchcraft or demonic possession, he had gone back to thinking it's fraud until proven otherwise. Now, he did believe it could be proved otherwise, but his instinct was the opposite of what it had been during the North Berwick witch trials. So it's a difficult thing for us to look at, because I think we want to have an image of him as witch hunter general, and you often hear he started the North Berwick witch trials. And I don't say any of this to exonerate him, because you're not your subject's champion, you're just their chronicler when you write a biography of them. He did, I think, do truly terrible things between 1590 and 1592. And there are some particular cases where he stepped way over the boundaries of due process to get convictions through. But I think for me, reading about those for chapter 8 of the book was more terrifying, because to see someone who could articulate all the reasons that you and I would, well, of course they confessed, you tortured them. To see how someone with that intelligence and that skepticism could turn and become, I mean, from skeptic to cheerleader is a frightening conversion. And I do think, he has blood on his hands of innocent people, but it's not also a cautionary lesson that, you act in haste, you repent at leisure. And when he put pen to paper with Demonology, it became one of the best-selling books of the late 16th and early 17th century. It was in print for years after he was dead and gone. And I think it's always useful to remember that what you put down on paper will outlast what might change in your heart.
And is that the reason why his reputations continue, do you think, as
yeah,
a hater?
Well, absolutely. I mean, also the fact that the witch hunts increased in England, and a lot of people said it was the influence of demonology and this Scottish king, because before he became king, the English witch hunts have been a lot smaller in Scotland. I mean, sort of the Scottish witch hunts condemned almost 10 times percentage of the population compared to England. But there were other reasons that things were shifting. I think in particular, the social breakdown that came with the Civil War really amps up the fear the devil's walking amongst them. I think the fact that demonology remains so successful and it keeps selling in big numbers, and witch hunters are using it into the 1690s and early 1700s. And the structure of demonology is interesting because it's written as a philosophical dialogue. So there are two characters in it, and one is the skeptic and one is the witch hunter or the believer. And the believer character rebuts every argument the skeptic has. So you almost get a sense of James trying to talk himself into it. But you have this quite thorough book going through the reasons why witchcraft is real and witch hunts are justified. And so that, yeah, I think that's why he's still remembered as the royal witch hunter.
That's so fascinating, though, isn't it? That he really did have quite a conversion back, and then, but that's
yeah. I mean, if you think,
stick.
well, it doesn't stick. And do you not think? I mean, it's a bit like, I suppose you think about people in the McCarthy hearings, or the Salem witch trials, or even people in the French Revolution who afterwards were like, I shouldn't have signed, so you voted for so many executions. Oops. And then when the monarchy comes back, they're even though they by this point repented, they're arrested because they're still remembered for that very vivid and horrible moment in their lives. But I do think it's a good lesson that what you put out into the world is much easier to put out than to bring it back in.
It is a good lesson. Let's end on something lighter then.
Sure, because it's such a lovely day.
It is a beautifully sunny day here. I think we're going to swelter in the tent, but it'll be very enjoyable. Now, you had to do a lot of travelling around Scotland and England, following James and his story, and we'll be retracing some of that next October. So October 2026, we're doing the Royal Scotland tour. Is there a place where you're really looking forward to revisiting?
Oh, well, to be honest, with Scotland, all of them, which is unhelpful. But, I mean, I was going to start doing the whole list. Of all of them, I think would be Stirling Castle. I mean, I know you must have known that would probably be the answer because I feel like a one-man Stirling Castle band. I loved it. I think it is one of the most magically impressive buildings I've ever been in. It is, I think it's Historic Environment Scotland that maintain it. And the current Earl of Mar is still the keeper, still the commander of the castle, and they've been that since James was there. And they have the Great Hall, which is immaculately preserved. They have the chapel James built to baptize his son, Prince Frederick. And they have completely restored the wing of the private apartments to how they would have looked in the 1530s when James's grandparents, Marie of Guise and James V, were in residence. The views are spectacular. I genuinely think it's like stepping back in time. It's magnificent.
So would he recognise it if he
yes.
came back today?
Yeah, I think he would. That's a good question actually, because I wonder where those apartments, those adult apartments, they might actually be in some good condition when James VI was there. But yeah, he would. There's one bit. I think it's the military museum in it that's 18th century that's replaced a wing that collapsed. But yeah, he would recognise the peach colour of the Great Hall.
Oh yes, we talked about this. So tell people about the peach colour, the controversial peach.
The parliamentary question peach. So it's such a great point because we always think we know what the past looked like and we're very certain. And the hall, I think in the 19th century, the Great Hall at Stirling Castle was turned into military barracks. So it really was never in great condition throughout the 20th century. And then towards the end of it, they decided that they would do a full restoration to how it would have looked. Primarily when James VI was there, because they had better records for that. But they also had quite good records of the exterior from the reign of James IV at the start of the 16th century. And he had built the Great Hall. And they discovered that there was a colour that he had used for the outside called the King's Gold, or the King's Gold. And they got the recipe for it. And they decided they were going to make it look exactly how it looked. And the whole Great Hall, which is visible, I should say, from the outside and from miles around, was tarped for like half a generation, because it took years to do this and restore it. And then one day the tarp came down, and the people in the area, some of them knew and others didn't. The news reporters certainly didn't. Thought that it had always been grey, because that's what medieval buildings are. And then this luminous peach colour emerges, and people were so incensed. There were protests because they thought that these sort of liberals at Historic Environment Scotland decided to paint it pink.
Being cute. Yeah.
And there were questions on the floor of the House of Commons to Prime Minister John Major saying, how has historic environment Scotland been allowed to do this? And they had to say, this is the colour that James IV chose. And we just don't think of a gentle off peach being at the early 16th century. But yeah, it's the peach great hole. So he would recognise that. He would recognise the giant peach. James the giant peach. Damn it. The pun was there. Sorry, the pun was there the whole time. How devastating.
Oh, well,
James, mortifying.
Oh, well, on that note, tell everyone where they can find you online.
Sorry, I just realised also another Roald Dahl pun. We had James the Giant Peach and the Witches. Idiot, Gareth. Yes, online you can find me severely delayed with my historical puns at _Gareth Russell on Instagram, Gareth Russell, historian and author on Facebook, and my podcast is Single Malt History.
Which is excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gareth.
No, thank you.